Good morning. I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Mr. Bruce Fein. Bruce Fein was the Associate Deputy Attorney General and General Counsel to the Federal Communications Commission under President Ronald Reagan. He served as Research Director for Republicans on the Joint Congressional Committee on Covert Arms Sales to Iran and on the American Bar Association's Committee on Presidential Signing Statements. He has been a visiting fellow for constitutional studies at the Heritage Foundation and an adjunct scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He has advised numerous countries on constitutional reform, including South Africa, Hungary, and Russia. He is regularly called to testify before the House and Senate Judiciary and Foreign Relations Committees. Mr. Fein is the founding member of Bruce Fein and Associates, Inc., a law corporation and a principal of public advocacy organization, the Litchfield Group. He is also a co-counsel for the Turkish American Legal Defense Fund, an arm of a 501c3 organization. He is author of Constitutional Peril, The Life and Death Struggle for Our Constitution and Democracy, and also American Empire Before the Fall. Without further ado, Mr. Bruce Fein.
Well, thank you for coming on a very chilly morning to examine, I think, the close to ruination of the American Republic. I think I can best demonstrate the psychology of empire by recreating an exchange between Senator Rand Paul and CIA Director nominee John Brennan during his confirmation hearing. Senator Paul inquired in substance whether or not the president or the director of the CIA was empowered to kill any American in the United States by playing prosecutor, judge, jury, and executioner in secret on the president say-so alone. In response, the nominee declined to answer. He wasn't sure, in other words, whether the president could kill every one of us in this room, indeed any American citizen living in the United States, based upon his unilateral decision that we were some kind of threat to the Republic. A proposition that would take us back to pre-Magna Carta days. That was 1215, Article 39, no one shall be deprived of his life without due process of law. And that is a demonstration of empire attitude. Everything, including your life, is subordinated to the claims of national security, concocted or genuine. Now, implicit in the answer of Mr. Brennan was his assertion that if you were outside the United States, for example, you stepped foot in Canada across the border or Mexico, then of course you could be killed with impunity. But there was a debate whether you step back in, there might be some due process protection. It is impossible to identify any other official in the history of mankind who has claimed authority of such tyrannical proportions. Genghis Khan, Ivan the Terrible, Caligula, none of them asserted the authority to kill not only all of their citizens, but every creature on the planet based upon a secret unilateral decision, untested by any other body, undisclosed to any other person, that the victim was an imminent threat to the United States. The reason that should create some alarm in the audience is that it has taken us back to the times before the Declaration of Independence, which asserted that our right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness did not depend upon the indulgence of any government, did not depend upon the indulgence of any official. It was inherent because we were born human beings. And the only way those liberties inherent in our existence could be curtailed was through due process of law. An accusation, a trial, an opportunity to discredit the evidence submitted against you. Now, this comes from a country that purports to be the beacon of liberty and democracy around the world. And having read 1984, long before 1984, I could not have conceived I would be living in a country which, with regard to deceit and untruthfulness, bettered the instruction of the Ministry of Truth in 1984. I mean, we can laugh at it, and I suppose that's the only solace we can get out of our current plight, where we have been unilaterally reduced to vassalage by the decree of the President, open and notorious, and acquiesced in by the Congress of the United States, and, in a larger sense, the American people. These crimes against the Constitution that the President has executed through his predator drone killing or assassination program are not discovered only by archaeological expeditions. They're open, they're notorious. The President's minions virtually boasted of his authority to kill any living creature on the planet, sort of in the manner, I suppose, of Genesis before Noah's Ark, in disclosing this information to the New York Times, boasting rather than being ashamed of it. Now, it's true that there are political constraints that are independent of the law that at present have caused President Obama to refrain from killing the likes of anyone in this room. But they're political restraints. They're not rights that we can assert against an omnipotent, tyrannical power in the White House. And if we ask, what is the psychology that has led this country to acquiesce in such tyranny, a country whose birth certificate was the overthrow of King George III for doing such dastardly things as depriving us of a right to trial by jury? Now we've come to the stage where we honor no trial at all, not to say whether it's by jury or by an admiralty judge. And it is, in my judgment, explained by the psychology of empire, whose primary earmark is to subordinate everything to a claim of national security, to subordinate anything that some official says might make us a tiny bit safer, even if the assertion is demonstrably false. And it is this psychology of empire that has led us from the days where we have Patrick Henry stating, "Give me liberty or give me death," till today where the public and the Congress is saying, "Hey, you make us safe, we will surrender our humanity. We will surrender all of our liberties as long as you say you'll keep us safe." And the companion earmark to the psychology of empire, which subordinates everything readily to a national security claim, is this utopian quest for a risk-free existence. And the oddity of this quest is that it rises to its high water mark just as the actual existential threat that the empire confronts has been reduced to the lowest level in the history of the world. Think of it, we have a national security budget of $1.2 trillion annually. It exceeds the combined defense spending of the rest of the world together. We have the most powerful weapons, 5,000 or more nuclear warheads, the most sophisticated targeted missiles that are shot from our aircraft, 13 aircraft carriers, fleets. No other country really has any aircraft carriers. And we pretend as though the likes of Osama bin Laden, some crazy criminals, can threaten the existence of the United States. Even though everyone in this room, I would wager, has never lost a wink of sleep thinking that Al-Qaeda will come and destroy their homes and take their liberties. Never. And I would suggest that's true of everyone in the White House. We create this huge, monstrous legal architecture that encroaches and destroys liberty based upon the idea that, we look at those videos, Osama looks really bad. Now suddenly all of our lives must be imperiled. Instead of standing back and thinking, what is the actual nature of the danger? Is it really the likes of World War II confronting Hitler's Luftwaffe There are 15 to 17 million in the Nazi and the Japanese armed forces, failing to recognize that if our troop to enemy ratio that we have employed in Afghanistan in fighting al-Qaeda, if that same ratio were employed in World War II against Germany and Japan, we would have had fielded an armed force of 3.5 billion Americans. We would have had to multiply the entire population of the United States by 126 and conscripted all of them. Moreover, we were confronting two countries with big industrial bases. They had advanced technology, they had advanced scientists, they had strong economies. Compared to al-Qaeda, has no cells in the United States. They are truly evil in the sense of wishing to bring mayhem on whoever they can confront. But an existential threat that requires us to abandon all the time-honored procedural safeguards against tyranny, checks and balances, it doesn't even come close to satisfying that standard. And yet, why is it that the American people in Congress continue to acquiesce? And to show, I think, how pervasive this empire psychology is, this quest for risk-free existence is, think of the evolution from the Patriot Act onward. We're now about 11, 12 years beyond 9/11. As we have become more knowledgeable about how tiny al-Qaeda is, even the Counterterrorism Center of the CIA estimates the maximum al-Qaeda in Afghanistan at maybe 50. I spoke to someone who'd spent 2 tours in Afghanistan and said, we haven't killed a single al-Qaeda in Afghanistan for almost 2 years. There aren't any left. There aren't any left. If we try to think about how we've responded to what we know is a diminishing threat, we keep escalating the encroachments on our liberties. It went from the Patriot Act, and we were told that we were fighting in Afghanistan so we could keep the war 6,000 miles away from the United States. Otherwise, we'd be fighting here in Washington, D.C. And then the latest iteration of the National Defense Authorization Act that empowered the president to use the military to detain American citizens here on the theory that we might be associated with forces that provide some kind of threat, not only to the United States, but to our allies, unidentified in the fight against terrorism. And we're told, as the NDA's most recent iteration was enacted, we have to take the battlefield here to the United States. And when someone detained here asks for a lawyer, we tell them, shut up. You know, we're an empire. We don't recognize rights. And saying that not in embarrassment for an American, but as a boast. It lists Lindsey Graham from South Carolina. Other than John McCain, I think he's number 2 in the queue for invading every country in the world that he doesn't like, which probably is about 70 or 80. So he's got them all lined up in the queue. He's got his little cards, like the ones we used in Iraq, which ones we were going to kill, 1, 2, 3. Sometimes we have to reinvent the cards, like in Afghanistan, where we've killed the number 2 of al-Qaeda, I think 37 times. It's the riskiest job in all of the world. So they really have to give you a lot of life insurance in order for anyone to take the job. And then we pretend that actually we know who gets elevated there, as though they have an organization chart and they announce in the news, hey, so-and-so has been elevated to number 2 of al-Qaeda, right? No, but then we have the experts that identified the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq to tell us they really do know. They really know who the guilty is. In fact, I'm not sure why we don't just abandon our civil justice system here. We just hire the CIA. Just tell us all the guilty people. We save all this money. We don't need these trials anymore. Get rid of the FBI. We don't need all these contentious debates over who's going to be confirmed to federal judgeships. It's antiquated. And we're already somewhere down that road. If we think of one of our cornerstone checks against empire, against tyranny, it's supposed to be an independent judiciary, entrusted with the final definitive interpretation of the Constitution in cases and controversies. Now, I've got a case now. It's in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit, in which my clients had their sons and daughters massacred, killed by the Sri Lankan President Mahinda Rajapaksa. It was sort of a genocidal campaign in the last years of a very, very protracted civil war. These were not members of the Tamil Tigers. If you want to view something, I wouldn't recommend it unless you're on an empty stomach, that's worse than the Holocaust Museum tour. You watch Channel 4 documentary from the British demonstrating the bombing of hospitals. The soldiers were so demented, they took cell phone pictures of themselves cutting off heads, taking pistols to people's children's heads, shooting them off. In any event, the position of the United States government in this suit brought under the Torture Victims Protection Act, which enables the survivor of someone who's killed by an extrajudicial killing to sue, called an individual who acted under color of foreign law. The position of the Justice Department, the Obama Justice Department, is the executive decides who is immune from suit and who is not. And the courts are to be errand boys of the executive branch. So, all right, if you say you can't sue that defendant from the Justice Department, then the judiciary goes, aye, aye, sir, and enters judgment dismissing the case. That is the proposition by someone who used to be on the other side. His name is Harold Koh, who was dean of Yale Law School, and before he was appointed, and I think thinking Hillary might win the 2016 elections and he could get promoted to the U.S. Supreme Court, he was on the opposite side of executive authority unconstrained by judicial and legislative checks. I testified on many panels with him, but suddenly, he was corrupted when he became legal advisor to then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and say, no, the executive decides, and the judiciary is reduced to ink blots. They just register what the executive states. And that's also the position that the executive is taking in suits brought by persons who have been victims, or representatives, persons who have been victims by the predator drone assassinations. Before the case gets to trial, and Mr. Al-Awlaki's fathers tried to bring suit on his behalf, the government tells the judiciary, president is immune. This is state secrets. Dismiss the case. We're not showing you anything. It's not only beyond that. Even in cases that are litigated out of Guantanamo Bay, where the government regularly submits classified evidence to justify detaining somebody indefinitely, for life, classified evidence that the detainee never can see. When opinions are written, they are redacted. Looks like you're reading a CIA report, and you're a lawyer trying to determine whether this case applies to yours. And the executive branch tells the judicial branch what parts of the opinion can be published. Really? Secret law? I mean, I used to read about these types of situations in Alexander Solzhenitsyn's books about the Gulag Archipelago. When I was really young, I said, wow, the Soviet Union is so bad, which it was. Or Mao Zedong's, kangaroo courts. This is the United States? Redacted opinions? How do you know what the law is? And that's why it's an easy segue into President Obama's statement, I have authority to kill any living creature on the planet, but I'm not going to tell you why. It's too secret. You might get the misimpression that I was a tyrant if I disclosed it. So we have to conceal it from you. And actually, I might have made an error in interpreting my authority, and I wouldn't want you to know that. Secret law? You have to go back as far as Caligula, printing laws in really, really tiny print on the walls of Rome to try to snare his enemies into violations. That's due process of law. And I say, what is stunning is not that the executive branch would seek to absorb all other powers within its domain. The Founding Fathers understood you needed to have ambition counteract ambition in order to check any branch of government. And they made regular deductions to what they styled the ordinary depravity of human nature in entrusting different authorities to different branches. So it's not unexpected that the executive would seek to usurp authority. What is stunning is that the Congress readily surrenders the authority. There's no fight. There's no protest. All right, if you want to do it, we don't want to be too contentious. We don't want to be acerbic. We'll just be dupes. We'll be like extras in a Cecil B. DeMille extravaganza. You know? But the president will have all the starring roles. Really? Is that what the members of Congress are elected to undertake? I always thought Article 6 instructed there one allegiance, one alone, was to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States. It's written very prominently in Article 6. You don't even have to be a speed reader. You can even be as dull as Rick Perry or somebody and get through that sentence, right? You don't have to celebrate great IQs. It's a simple understanding. Your one allegiance is to the Constitution of the United States. And where are these members of Congress? Nancy Pelosi. Impeachment's off the table. Oh, really? You can white out parts of the Constitution on your say-so alone? Really, Miss Pelosi? That's your authority? Remember, she was confronted with a question about what was the Constitution of the Affordable Health Care Bill? She says, are you kidding? We don't do constitutions around here. No, that's for banana republics to worry about constraints. We do whatever we want. This is a Speaker of the House, a constitutional illiterate. We're entrusting that person with power to check the executive branch. And that's just, I don't want to necessarily point out Pelosi's intellectual deficiencies, but that's characteristic of the entire Congress. Now, annually I debate John Yoo at the National Defense University on issues of executive power. And on one of these occasions, Mr. Yoo disclosed that when the Iraqi war resolution was initially drafted, it was by the executive branch because the Congress didn't want their fingerprints on anything as so contentious as war, peace. That when the draft was circulated to the House and the Senate, the members, including the Republicans, were angry. Their response was, we don't want to vote on that bill. It's not our responsibility. It could create an issue for an opponent or something. You decide on your own whether to go to war. Really? Have you read the Constitution? Half of the Constitutional Convention and the Federalist Papers are devoted to issues of war and peace. Half. And there was unanimity. No one individual, even the individual with Senate consent, can take us from a state of peace to a state of war. The Founding Fathers were very long-headed, and they actually read rather than taking their news off the internet or by osmosis. And they recognized that the history of mankind was the history of executives unilaterally concocting dangers to justify war because that's the time when all power gets concentrated in the executive branch. It wasn't parliamentary bodies. It wasn't the French Parliament, but Napoleon who was traipsing all over Europe to go to war. And when the Israelis or the Jews began to be empire-minded, it was when they turned to kings from the Sanhedrins. And say, we can understand from human nature why that would be the case. Because those who enter politics typically are megalomaniacs. They're there for power. They get gratification out of dominating others. They're not a random sample of the human species. And therefore, the Founding Fathers said, we need impenetrable checks on executive concoctions of danger to enter war. Not only would they be unjustified, but the corollary was that in times of war, the law is silent. The Founding Fathers were not superficial and recognized that not only would all power go to the executive, but the executive would be unconstrained by the customary judicial checks on overreaching. And James Madison lectured that the instruments that are developed purportedly to fight foreign danger invariably come back domestically to destroy liberty. It wasn't that the Founding Fathers never believed in war. Obviously, if you have to fight in self-defense. But they wanted to make the standard, the threshold, very, very high because war is lawless. War brings you to a state of nature. Even in situations where abuses are disclosed, the punishments are tiny, whether it's Abu Ghraib or, remember, if you're, I don't know, you're not old enough to remember the My Lai massacre and Lieutenant Calley, the one person who was actually court-martialed and convicted for killing women and children in a ditch in My Lai, Vietnam. he was soon sentenced community, served maybe a year. It's simply because I think it's human to give enormous amount of dispensation to any individual who's told, hey, you fight and put your life on the line for your country, and if you happen to disobey, I mean, it's sort of an oxymoron to talk about laws of war, because laws regulating how you kill other people. Remember, the definition of war is it makes what's customarily murder legal. That's the definition of war, which is the reason why you want to have a high threshold. You can imagine what life is like where anyone can kill anyone else with impunity. It's what Hobbes described as a life that's short, brutish, nasty, and poor in his Leviathan. So we have the Constitution as clear as can be with regard to which body is authorized to initiate war, the Congress of the United States. And that was because the Congress has no conflict of interest. In times of war, congressional power diminishes. And the Founding Fathers said, well, that's it, the place where we want the decision to go to war made, because it won't be based upon concocted fears. It will be genuine fears. And that is how the war powers were initially interpreted and applied. George Washington, the first president, said you can make no offensive use of the military without congressional authority. Thomas Jefferson had 9 congressional statutes authorizing his attacks on the Barbary pirates. In the early 1800s, James Madison, the father of the Constitution, needed a congressional authorization for the War of 1812. And it is also true that the recognition of the Founding Fathers that we were not endowed by God to go abroad in search of monsters to destroy were implemented through our actual policy. Early on in the life of our nation, Central and Latin America, South America erupted in revolt against the Portuguese and Spanish colonies, about 1809, 1810. And these revolts were purportedly, like Arab Spring, against tyrannical power, which was certainly true, and hoping that a more democratic dispensation could be implemented. But the United States didn't do anything to try to aid one side or the other. It said, we wish freedom abroad, but we fight only to defend our own. We did not intervene. We only recognized the new nations in Central and South America until their old colonial masters recognized them. And it was what John Quincy Adams observed when he made his July 4th, 1821 address to Congress as then Secretary of State. He said, yes, we could be dictatress of the world. We could be. But our policy would shift from a policy of freedom of liberty to a policy of coercion and domination, and that would be the ruination of the Republic. As he stated, the glory of the Republic is liberty. The glory of empire is domination and control. The glory of the Republic is knowledge and wisdom. The glory of empire is the foot soldier and death. That's why you would see empires celebrate whom? On their statues in their capital cities. Warriors, those who achieve fame by killing other people. Unfortunately, that's what happens in the United States as well. If you look around Washington, D.C., who's on these pedestals? It's not Rodin's The Thinker, right? It's not Socrates. It's not Nestor in the Iliad and the Odyssey. It's people who kill other people. And I underscore, it's not to be pacifist. We all have a right and a duty of self-defense. But it means we have to be careful about exercising power and domination for its own sake. Now, we confront a very difficult challenge. It's not unique to this country. It's to human nature. I think we are hardwired to find some kind of gratification out of dominating, out of kinetic energy, out of controlling other people. If you look at our fairy tales, if you look at our literature, who are the heroes? The heroes are those, they're Sir Lancelot, or they're Hercules, or they're Achilles, or Hector, people who are viewed as very strong. And we grow up looking at the Lone Ranger. The people we want to model ourselves on are the people who are tough physically, not those who use their brains to think about virtue and prudence and restraint. And so it's difficult without a highly educated public, as well as leaders who understand that true greatness is in restraint. True greatness is in understanding their own fallibility, not being too fast to dominate and dictate to others. It's very, very difficult when you're young to appreciate that because you got hormones, you got all sorts of energy. And in some sense, and I don't want to be critical, you're too dumb to know the long scope of your life between ashes to ashes and dust to dust and what counts in the long run. So that your sepulcher is not in the earth. Your sepulcher is to live in the hearts and minds of those living and those yet to be born. That's the greatest sepulcher there can be. And that comes from character, restraint, from controlling our gratifications and appetites. I've once described the difference between a juvenile culture, which is what ours is, that celebrates and honors and thrills at sex, money, power, creature comforts, domination, as opposed to adult culture that celebrates and honors knowledge, wisdom, virtue, humility, self-restraint. And look at our culture. I mean, all our icons, I call them moral wretches. I guess I was most shocked in my life. I've been exposed to many things worthy of shock. When my executive assistant forced me to imbibe 5 minutes of Honey Boo Boo and Snooki. And they said, this is the death of the species. You know? We've destroyed ourselves, and no one's had to fire. This is much worse than Al-Qaeda. You know? Because it reduces life. You know, it's such a primitive savagery, like we're an amoeba. And how could that kind of character elicit such enormous, overwhelming response? People watch it, in fact, and people get paid for doing these things. So when we think about where our country is, you know, what is it that we can do to throw off this, what I call the yoke of empire? And it's difficult, in part because all prior 72 empires of the world have raced to ruination. You know, even Winston Churchill, he said, I have not been elected prime minister to preside over the dissolution of the British Empire. That's exactly what he did do. He didn't understand the virtues of restraint. He was very noble, very courageous in many ways. He was responsible for defeating the Nazis in large measure, but he didn't understand the larger purpose of government itself. And we need to get back to first principles. And the first to recognize is that the final end of the state is to make men and women free to develop their faculties. That's why we have government. That's why men and women remove themselves from a state of nature. The final end of the state isn't to become number one, you know, around the world, like we're competing for the NCAA ranking to get into the Rose Bowl or something. You know? And the true tragedy of the United States is we're reduced. Politics of the highest sort. Politics where we want everyone to be a winner. We're all Americans. We don't want to gloat. We don't want to taunt anyone because they've fallen down. We want to give them an equal opportunity, a fair chance in life. But they have to make it themselves. It's not dependent upon government. That's what it's about. That's what politics is. It's not a game. The red team and the blue team, all the sports metaphors that come in discussing politics, you know, it's a contact sport. It's not a sport at all. It's about civilization. It's about decency. It's about humility. It's about recognizing due process. We all could err. And it's become so ingrained into our political system, it's hard to know how you can eradicate it. Because both sides talk about politics as though it's defeating the other side. Anything happens, well, will this benefit X or Y? Instead of, hey, is this good for the country? Which should be the first question, right? And the Founding Fathers were very wise, but one thing they did not anticipate was the development of political parties, which George Washington viewed as the bane of any republic. And partly it was because Washington himself was such a commanding presence. Everyone knew he would be president, and he was elected twice. Not a single dissenting vote in the Electoral College against Washington. And he was so dominating that all of his minions declined to develop their own factions, which happened as soon as he left the White House in 1796. And that's most unfortunate because when you, it may be that political parties are the lifeblood of any democratic dispensation, but it also may have the same seeds of destroying the democracy. Because if you have a country where the politics is not about making everybody win, but one side defeats the other side, you sort of jump on their grave after they've lost. That misunderstands what politics is about. If we want to make it the grand quest for upgrading civilization rather than reducing the country and domestic relations to what I would call savagery. You just want to defeat and pummel the other person. And part of this comes, I think, because our politicians today, and part of it is the education and the culture, they come to politics not because they want to make America great because of virtue and character, but they're there because they crave publicity. They want obsequious sycophants around them that will celebrate them as God and flawless. They are irresponsible. They don't want to take accountability for any decision. They'll surrender it to somebody else. And most importantly, they are aphilosophical. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that they have no guiding principle in life. Everything is subject to expediency. Will it help my party or hurt my party? And that's why you will see members regularly. They'll say on one day the equivalent of, I believe in the geocentric theory of the universe, and then the next day they believe in the heliocentric theory of the universe, and it flips back and forth. And not that they've read Ptolemy and Galileo and then chose between the two. Probably they don't know Ptolemy, and they probably don't know Galileo or Copernicus. But hey, whatever is good politically is what I believe in for that day. And that's ruination of a country. And it makes you, I think, crave an opportunity to remove yourself from the political equation. But that's not an option for those in this room or for me either. You have to stay and fight and try to reform, even if it looks like we're at the foot of Mount Everest, because we have fallen so far, more than Lucifer when he's cast out of heaven and ended up in hell, from our initial Republican ideals, that it will take decades in order to change our culture. So we have a true politics where everyone is a winner, where character and virtue and restraint are the earmarks of our greatness, not 6,000 nuclear weapons and marching around the world and telling everybody else how they ought to run their country, which we're not very good at anyway. And we could give legions of examples, but one, just to point out how we bring misery on ourselves, is Iran. We forget, we actually overthrew Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953, the first really, truly elected democratic prime minister of Iran, in favor of the Shah, who then surrenders to the Ayatollah, and we end up with crazy Islamic radicals. But that's us. We created it. You know who first provided Iran with nuclear reactor? Us, with the Shah. Now we wonder, that's so terrible. Who dastardly would give the Iranians any nuclear knowledge or capacity? Us, right? Just like Al-Qaeda. Who gave the Mujahideen, the precursors of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, all these Stinger missiles, all this money to develop a capacity to kill, to throw out the Soviets? Charlie Wilson's war. It was us. It's really astonishing that Charlie Wilson still gets kudos. He brought the Stinger missiles to these people. But you stopped in midstream. You don't finish the story. Charlie, those are the same people who brought us 9/11. And you want to be praised because of your cowboy-like enthusiasm for fighting and violence? But those are just two examples, and you can multiply them endlessly. Benghazi. Why is it that someone had a motivation, to kill our ambassador to Libya? Well, did we think, we went in, we bombed, we destroyed Libya, we threw out Gaddafi, who then was wrongly executed by our benefactors? Libya has 126 militias. It's a semi-anarchic Somalia. And we go, why would anyone think we were responsible for any of the havoc in Libya? Well, maybe because we dropped bombs and destroyed it. That's not really a fantastical judgment to make. But all the brouhahas, not over the illegal unilateral war in Libya and the craziness of punishing the one ruler who renounced weapons of mass destruction and sending a message to North Korea and Iran: if there's one way you want to keep the U.S. out from overthrowing your regime, get nuclear weapons. That's a really smart thing to do, isn't it? But now we're just worried about, how many more bricks we should have had around the consulate to defend against the attack, instead of asking, maybe if we didn't do the things that provoked the attack, we wouldn't need the bricks. They weren't attacking France or Germany or any other consulates there. So what's to be done? I've sort of painted a bleak picture, and I do think it's bleak. On the other hand, we, unlike any other empire, do have a birth certificate of which we can be proud, of which we can return to our fundamental values and character that instinctively appeal even to the unschooled and unlearned, because most will not immediately criticize George Washington, James Madison, and Thomas Jefferson. After all, it smacks of being an ingrate if we denounce those who are at Valley Forge or Cemetery Ridge, sacrificed vastly more than any of we have in order to give us freedom, and then we turn against them. But maybe it's not too unusual. Remember what Mark Twain said about the difference between a man and a dog? If you rescue a dog and you feed him, he does not bite your hand, unlike a man. And that's what I feel. I read, and maybe it's because I was born in Cambridge, so my first poem was Paul Revere's Ride. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. It was the 17th of April in 75, and barely a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. So I grew up there. Old North Bridge, by the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flags to April's breeze unfurled. Here once the embattled farmer stood and fired the shot heard round the world. So I was imbued. These people made huge sacrifices. And before the Constitutional Convention, they didn't play video games. James Madison read every single history of every confederacy from the beginning of time. They knew this was a serious exercise. They sacrificed. And what are we, this generation, that has so little effort needed in order to restore the republic? We just throw up our hands and do nothing? People think that the cause of impeachment is like a coup d'etat. They're too ignorant to remember that Benjamin Franklin at the Constitutional Convention said, impeachment's a substitute for assassination to get rid of tyrants. It's the most civilized way that removes someone who cannot be trusted with power from office. And you don't send them to Siberia or Butte, Montana, or any other place. So if we are to honor those of our forefathers who sacrificed so much, we only have one path to lead. And that's to become involved in politics, to write, to speak. It's not enough to just be silent. Say, this is wrong. There should be people protesting. We don't want a government that kills people with predator drones with no due process because of what it says about us, not because we think Al-Qaeda and terrorists are bad. Adolf Eichmann was bad. He got a trial in Jerusalem. There's evidence. We give people trials because of what it says about us in due process, not because the people who are defendants are all great people. We need to return to the time when we're proud of our country and its ideals, proud that it honors procedural protections, proud that we're restrained and we don't dictate to others and boast, we're the leader of the world. Remember the third debate between Romney and Obama? Both of them saying, God has entrusted the mantle of leadership to us, and we can't escape its duties. Really? How do you know? Was there a vote? What are the duties of leadership? Like Atlas holding up the world? The duties of leadership are to give examples of predator drone killings and detentions without accusation or charge? That's what leadership is? Really? Now, you're young, and my prediction is if you and we who are older do not hang together and fight every single day against this tyranny of empire thinking, it's only a matter of time, 30, 40 years before you are in the grave, our republic will have fallen to the same ruins of the Roman Colosseum, which you can visit in Rome and recognize what the consequences of inertness, indifference are to encroaches on liberty. Thanks, and I accept questions now. This gentleman, I don't know we have microphones if there's difficulty in hearing, although there's not a whole lot of space between the...
I'll speak up.
All right, great.
So you talk about political involvement, but I think maybe implicit in any critique of empire is the recourse that Brutus and Cassius took when they faced growing empire at Rome. So I wonder if you could maybe talk or speak to when is armed rebellion or use of force ever justified in seeing empire grow?
Sure. I mean, it's a great question. That's the one that Benjamin Franklin anticipated. So that's why we have the power of impeachment, which means that's where we have to rally first. My baptism in Washington was Watergate. And first disclosures, there wasn't any groundswell for impeaching President Nixon, even though he would say, if the president does it, it's legal. I said, where's that in the Constitution, sir? It is our birth certificate. And in ancient Rome, when Brutus and Cassius were plotting, there wasn't a power of impeachment. We have that power. It's an effort to try to have civilized methods of removing those who endanger our liberties from authority. But if we go back to the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, which was written prior to the Constitution, there was any impeachment authority, and try to take guidance from the authors. Jefferson writes that your first obligation when you confront tyranny is through redress, grievances, petition, whatever. But then he goes on to state that if every act of a ruler evinces a design to exercise tyranny and to reduce you to serfdom, at that time, he says, you not only have a right, you have a duty to revolt. Now, he says you should be very careful about drawing that line, coming to the conclusion that political remedies are totally futile. Because in times of conflict, it's typical that evil people come to the fore, because power then gravitates to those who are expert in killing, not in respecting liberty. But there can be situations like that, he says. Now, are we there in the United States now? I don't think so. We certainly have not exhausted the impeachment provision. And it's a matter of prudence. Remember the French Revolution. It started out with the campaign marching on the Bastille, and it began with an effort to reform the French Constitution that had been dormant for about 3 centuries. During that period, the Estates General had never been summoned. And the first constitutional reform was to create a limited monarchy. It had veto power, but much of the absolutism of the Bourbons was constrained. Louis XVI, being as stupid as he was, attempted to flee with Marie Antoinette and escape his temporary detention, joined forces with other royalist groups who were invading France, and it all went downhill from then. And so the French, who began the revolution with a limited monarchy, ended up with Napoleon, who coronated himself and sort of embarrassed the Pope, who thought that was his role when he was summoned to France after Napoleon had marched as far as he could around the world. And that's an example where, in the fight for liberty, they ended up with less rather than more at the end of the equation. I can't give you a clear answer. I don't think Jefferson and those who drafted the Declaration have a clear answer. It's just a sense of what seems to be at least plausible. And we certainly have not exhausted in the United States the impeachment remedy. It's true that Congress is an invertebrate institution at present and won't act, but that's in large measure because the citizenry hasn't been aroused and awakened. Yeah. Yes?
Say if impeachment successfully passes Congress, we remove Obama, then we get Joe Biden. How does that improve anything?
Well, listen, I'm not somebody who celebrates Joe Biden. If we want to go back to the allusion to Cassius and Brutus in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, I once wrote a piece about Mr. Biden and explaining why it was that in 2007, when Biden was running for the nomination for the presidency, he had stated unequivocally that if Mr. Bush bombed Iran, used warlike measures against Iran, he had consulted all his brilliant professors at Harvard, and he knew it was an impeachable offense, and he would spend his entire remaining career in the Senate to see that Mr. Bush would be impeached and removed from office. Because, he said, no president can initiate war without authorization from Congress. Then comes Libya, where the president says, I don't need Congress. After all, I've spoken to the Arab League, and they said it's okay. My friends at the UN Security Council said it's okay. Why do I need to pay any attention to Congress? I mean, they're just elected. And so you have a flagrant unilateral war by the president. I said, well, Mr. Biden, what did you say in 2007? And in my apocryphal column, I said, well, his response, it wasn't that he loved the Constitution less, but he loved power and prime real estate in the West Wing more, that he remained silent. So that's Joe Biden for you. Not a man of principle, but so long as he complies with the Constitution, so be it. If he imitates what Mr. Obama had done, we need to impeach and remove him as well. Now, I also want to underscore that the impeachment power is not confined to executive officials. In fact, the very first impeachment was brought against a senator, William Blount. And in my view, it's unfortunate that there's so many scoundrels in the Congress, but members of Congress who are flouting their obligation to uphold and defend the Constitution by nonfeasance more than malfeasance, but some of it's malfeasance too, and voting for clearly unconstitutional laws. They should be impeached as well. Unfortunately, the impeachment power is entrusted to Congress, and they're inclined to give their colleagues indulgence. But you as citizens need to know that that is a remedy for wrongdoing members because of inertness, idleness, or otherwise. Yes, sir.
I just think it's funny that he brings up Rome. He says, what should we look at a Cassius and Brutus solution? But then you realize they killed Caesar. He was dead, and then Octavius pops up, and then the Republic is gone. You have emperor after emperor after emperor.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's the Napoleon's succession to King Louis XVI.
And I think that's exactly the problem. You've got these kind of flagrant disregards for the small things, the little things that nobody looks at and says, it's not a big deal. This is the exact same thing that happened in Rome. And I mean, there are a lot of similarities.
Yes, I highly recommend. There's a 5-part series. So the first one is The Gates of Rome. Begins with the birth of Julius Caesar. That chronicles the downfall of the Roman Republic. And you read that and you'll say, if you know what's happening today, hey, this is exactly an antecedent of the United States. But that's not unique. You just go be Ecclesiastes, remember? What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There's nothing new under the sun. And what was meant by those words wasn't that technology doesn't change, but that the underlying narrative of the species, the quest for power, is the same. Even if the choreography changes, even if the background and the music and the dance step changes, even if the clothing changes, that underlying narrative remains the same. It's the challenge that any generation has to confront. And therefore, don't be vulnerable to the illusion that there's some sort of solution to the problem. There's no sort of final end solution, because even if you win the Republic back for your generation, unless those values are carried on by your successors, it'll plunge back in to tyranny and to empire. Because that's the natural state of the species, is tyranny and empire. Republic is an aberration, can only be achieved by leaders of impeccable character and great wisdom in the public to know who has political talent and who is just a scheming wretch wanting to feather his own pocket or pride or otherwise. And going back to an observation you made, what is it that's what, in my view, of the centerpiece of civilization? I think it's the most important idea ever invented, conceived of mankind. And it's this simple idea of due process, procedural protections. Now, why is that so central to non-fanatical tranquility in any society? Due process idea is the first time man recognizes that he could be wrong, or women as well. I don't want to leave out half the population like our founding fathers did in enfranchising the women. You could be wrong. You need to listen to another side. Events are multidimensional. They're not unidimensional. You've got to recognize people come from different backgrounds, experience, they interpret things differently. So due process, you have mechanisms by you give more than one viewpoint. Exposure, you have an impartial decision maker. That's the heart of civilization, that humility. I could be wrong. Let me hesitate. Let me do as best I can before I come to judgment. And that's been totally destroyed by our government. Due process. Heck with that. We always get it right. Don't question us. We'll kill you, and then after the fact, we'll decide whether we got you. We don't even do that. We don't even have post-mortems off people that we kill with predator drones. And that's what you should always remember, because that is the heart of civilization itself. Due process. Be humble. I could be wrong. Remember Socrates, the wise man knows what he doesn't know. Could be wrong. I need to listen. Doesn't mean you accept all criticism, but you're willing to open your ear to it. You're willing to go back and say, hey, maybe I don't know that. I need to read more. It's because when you don't have that honor and respect for due process in your civilization, that's what gives to the fanatics. I've just been told I have the word from Mount Sinai or otherwise, and you don't believe me, I got to kill you. You're the infidel. Really? I recently returned from a 2-week travel on business in Nigeria, and in the north, which is still semi-convulsed. During one of my days, there are 9 humanitarian aid workers who were slain because they were immunizing children from polio. Nigeria is one of 3 countries that still has vestiges of polio, measles, other kind of childhood diseases. And that was because imams came and said, listen, we're telling you there's a secret plot. Maybe it's because of our use of immunizations to try to catch Asama that this rumor penetrated all the way to Nigeria. And so, all right, everyone in that community, we got to kill these humanitarian aid workers. Say that's the fanaticism we have to repudiate. And I'm not trying to suggest it's Islam or Christianity or Judaism. It's all across the board. Remember, wherever you're born, whatever religion, whatever political affiliation, whatever gender, whatever nationality, whatever ethnicity, we all got the same DNA. All subject to the same temptations to vice. All possibilities of virtue are the same. And that should humble us to think that we're exceptional. We are all born with angelic DNA, and our opponents have the devil in their DNA. That's an arrogance that is guaranteed to create resentment and conflict. Yes, sir.
Earlier you spoke about the difference between juvenile and adult culture. Mm-hmm. Do you have any practical examples or tips for how to move the culture from being juvenile towards being adult?
It's really like turning your TV off the wrong channels. Encouraging. I've read my kids the Iliad and the Odyssey and Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's the people you talk to and what you patronize and what you don't. Now, it's a very difficult question to answer because the reason why cultures evolve is so complex. We really don't know exactly why. And I am inclined to revert to our civil rights movement, which I was involved in. For 100 years after the Civil War, there was Jim Crow. 5,000 lynchings. Nothing happened. Suddenly Rosa Parks said, I'm not going to the back of the bus. And there was a Montgomery bus boycott. And then there were marches at Selma, and little kids confronted cattle prods and water hoses, and people died. And the culture changed. Now you can't use the N-word with impunity. Why that happened after 100 years where all these efforts were futile, it's hard to know. All we know is it's a constructive way to do that. And you don't have to be like Savonarola and be pontifical in telling your friends and kids and your girlfriends and boyfriends. You need to make your views. That's just not the right thing to do. We're not going to patronize Snooki or it's just wrong. Not because we want to make it a crime. But we want to move beyond that juvenile thrill. And remember, when you're 15, you should act like 15, which means you're going to do dumb things. I was 15 too. But when you're past that and you're an adult, then you got to start acting like an adult and recognize that taunting others and all that kinetic energy, all the adrenaline that goes through your system when you're young, those are the thrills that have their place when you're a teenager. But government is much more daunting, and you have to go out of those childish thrills. But I say, go back to the family. Go back to those that say you should actually read rather than walking into a living room and you see a child, and I've seen they're looking at their laptop, they're listening to music, they got the cell phone and iPad, I think there's 13 different things that you're trying to absorb at the same time. I said, that's pandemonium, that's not learning anything. Yes?